graced with the presence of somebody who's an excellent activist and voice for the downtrodden and anti-imperialist, Greg J. Stoker. What's going on, Greg?
It's going. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you're a busy guy, so let's cut to the chase. Look, I wanted to let everybody at least get to know you. You were in the military, you were part of the problem, and then you became a problem to the problem. So what was your, what was this 180 about? What happened?
Oh, I spent the most formative years of my life, like literally on the spear tip of U.S. imperialism in the American Special Operations community. I was a former Army Ranger. I did 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan. And when I started shifting over to a more intelligence-oriented role and started actually engaging with what we were doing on a more than kinetic level, started being like, okay, you know what, this is problematic. And it really came with the drone strike policy under Obama. They're just watching the talk, like tactical operations centers associated with Joint Special Operations Command, just like watching dudes on a motorcycle get hit with Hellfire missiles and just asking the question, like, was there a standard of proof for like this guy actually being associated with a globally recognized terrorist organization, or was his phone just on the wrong contact list? Was he just a baker? We're not really sure, and that's not even getting into like Obama's controversial decisions to like drop weddings in Yemen, and yeah, it's just it didn't seem that it was aside from like the war crimes, it just didn't seem like a war that was meant to be won. So it was just, America kind of functions off the necro economy with, all these tax dollars going to wars to prop up these governments that, use the tax money to buy contracts from Northrop Grumman and Halliburton and all this stuff. And that money the public sector money goes back into the American private sector, and the politicians get kickbacks, and, war's a racket. And that's kind of where I started not wanting to re-enlist in the military. Yeah. I got out and studied post-colonial studies and international relations, and I was a private person until October 7th. Well, no, I was still private on October 7th. I didn't go public on social media and started putting my name and my reputation and who I am out there until like October 15th, when they were dropping 2,000-pound bombs in civilian neighborhoods in Gaza. And, there were military pundits on CNN saying like, no, you could do that. It's like, really? Because we couldn't. So what's up with the double standard? So that's how I got into the public sphere, just simply talking about that from a military perspective. And then here we are like 9 months later.
Yeah, that's amazing that was so recent.
Yeah.
But look, you're doing excellent work. My cousin joined the military, okay? And he was a cryptologist and stuff. He was high-ranking in the intelligence or whatever, I guess. And he ended up killing his whole family, like committed suicide and killed his whole family. And it was big news and stuff. But he used to tell me that he went to Afghanistan and they told guys would come off the lunch line and say, oh, I just got done killing like a whole family of people. Did you also experience like rhetoric with people that you were working around that you thought, well, these people are sort of immoral and weird, that doesn't fit?
Well, in special operations, we kind of didn't have like rules of engagement, and you could do whatever you wanted. I personally never saw any killings of entire families. In fact, like the amount of civilians that accidentally got killed by direct action small arms fire from special operations units were like almost nil. In my own personal experience, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but like dudes talk a lot of shit at a lunch line. So I think the real criminality was mostly through airstrikes. And not having any intelligence behind it, because it's easier. It's cheaper. It's cheaper to drop a 1,000-pound or shoot a 1,000-pound Hellfire or $100,000 Hellfire missile at a guy who might be a high-value target than it is sending in a special operations raid force, which is like multi-million dollars every night. So it was a whole problematic system. And again, I didn't think it was a war meant to be won, and I wasn't at the point in my military service at like in my early to mid 20s where I was like, you know what, this is an illegal war, we shouldn't be here. No, I mean, I didn't get to that place until I was in like late 20s, early 30s. But yeah, it was a process. But like when I hear people like, we killed entire families, it's like, dude, you weren't part of CIA Special Activities Division. You didn't do that. Just like shut up.
The most egregious are these airstrikes that are coming, there's no way that, how tactically accurate are these things? It seems like just willy-nilly.
Very. That's how kind of we differentiate between us and the Israelis. Like, they're so egregious with their indiscriminate bombings of things that they're kind of like gaslighting me into thinking we were the good guys. Because like, if in terms of moral equivalency, they make a lot of people look good, including the Canadians. But I think, they're all targeted. The problem is Israelis are the IDF. I don't want to characterize all Israelis as like that, but like their entire military apparatus is not just doing indiscriminate strikes on civilian infrastructure. They are literally dropping dumb ammunition, unguided bombs that once they leave the aircraft, they can land anywhere within a football field, a radius, or a soccer field. I know you guys are like, you're living in Europe now. I'm not sure what to call it, football or soccer, but like that is not precision. That you're not targeting anything. You're just literally bombing the crap out of everything. So there's definitely a difference. Like as bad as American strike packages were during the global war on terror, hate that term, they were nowhere near as bad as what's happening in Gaza and what's about to happen potentially in Lebanon.
And so you're a military guy, so you got a good analysis of strategy and stuff. Tell me a little bit about the white phosphorus. Is that being passed around in the moment? And what's the consensus on the legality of this? Okay,
well, I don't know if white phosphorus, or Willie P, as it's affectionately called, is actually being used at this moment. We do know it's been used in Gaza and in southern Lebanon above civilian targets, not just now, but it happened in 2014. This is nothing new for them to be shooting white phosphorus on people or over and there's no real military function to it. White phosphorus is just for destroying military material, like war-making equipment, fuel supplies, and masking armored formations from visual identification when they're like moving across a desert. It doesn't really have a lot of applications beyond that, and the fact that they're using it on enemy combatants, it's just like not even effective, and it's just a terror weapon. It's just a mechanism of terror, because those pellets burn at 1,000 degrees centigrade, and water doesn't put it out. The only way it really gets put out if it lands on you, where it burns into your body cavity and then loses oxygen, and it will keep burning through you until it runs out of air. That's the only way to stop it from burning. So yeah, it's a weapon of terror. It's not even militarily practical at all beyond that.
And have you seen this catapult now? Speaking of Lebanon, they're firing some kind of flaming catapult, flaming garbage. I don't know what they're launching it over the wall. What the hell's going on?
So 2 weeks ago, they constructed a trebuchet, which is a medieval siege weapon, just one to shoot flaming things into southern Lebanon, to quote, burn down the brush in southern Lebanon that Hezbollah was hiding to shoot rockets at them, which is, from a military perspective, absurd. They have incendiary rounds to burn things. Also, just one trebuchet is really going to do it. They're also shooting flaming arrows. It's like, dude, you just want to freaking, if you just want to LARP, just LARP. Don't like call it a military exercise, right? Plus, Hezbollah doesn't need to hide behind brush. They can shoot out of tunnels and hide sites. And, they have line of sight weapons, so they can hide behind rocks, which are better than brushes. It's just patently absurd. Yeah.
What I mainly wanted to ask you is, like, I love your reporting because you're probably one of the few people who is describing this whole thing, the whole Gaza genocide, in any other way than a pure, predicted victory for Israel. Like, you're the only person who's saying that they are not only just wrong morally, but they are not winning strategically. And I just want to see if you can flesh that out a bit for us and like just talk to us as much about that as you can.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there are different ways to conceptualize warfare. There are different generations of warfare. So, like, first generation is like swords, spears, kingdoms fighting kingdoms. Second generation's like the dawn of gunpowder. And so that kind of changed how war was fighting. Third generation was like modern conflict, state versus state actor. You know, World War II, America versus Imperial Japan, the Allies versus the Axis, states fighting states. Now, fourth generation warfare is kind of like where we start getting into Vietnam stuff, like an insurgency. It's asymmetrical. There's a state versus a non-state actor. So militarily, the state actor has the advantage. They have an air force, they have an armored corps, they have tanks, they have hundreds of thousands of recruits to draw upon. They have all this money and funding. And the non-state actor, like the Viet Cong, well, they might get funding and weapons from like the Chinese or like the Russians, and intelligence support from them. But really, it's just them with small arms, limited numbers, fighting against an imperial power. So if you take that to the modern conflict in Gaza, fourth generation, which is asymmetrical, which means they have this massive force and this massive military apparatus, and the resistance forces have like very little. There's like 40,000 of them in flip-flops with small arms. Yeah, they get a lot of they get intelligence support from like other actors like Iran and weapons from Iran, just like the Viet Cong did. And they also use tunnels, just like the Viet Cong did, because again, tunnels is what you use when you don't have air superiority, because you don't have an air force. So that's another part of the asymmetrical nature of this warfare. So basically, what we learned from the failure that was the imperial failure that was Vietnam is that the state actor that's in occupation of another country has to win militarily, because they will eventually run out of political capital and money, and so they have to win. All the non-state insurgent actor just has to do is just to not lose. So basically, it's the same principle applied to Gaza. The IDF has to win, which they can't, which veteran intelligence officers have told to Marib, Haaretz, Ynet News. Admiral Hagari, their main propaganda officer, has said we cannot defeat Hamas as an ideology. They can't even defeat them militarily, but they definitely can't defeat them as an ideology, because they've created something new in this world, a new acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. Like, resistance ain't going anywhere after that, right? And so they cannot win, but in Hamas basically won't lose, at least for another few years, and Israel doesn't have the amount of political capital to keep perpetuating a sustained campaign of ethnic cleansing for that long. Plus, they don't have the money. The U.S. support will eventually dwindle. They have all sorts of problems. So
Plus, they wear Pampers.
yeah, plus they wear Pampers. Apparently, that's still unverified for me, but it was a good PR coup that the Hamas spokesperson did with that little thing. But now, if we look at this strategically, because they're not going to win and Hamas isn't going to lose, we could say, like, okay, what were their objectives? So the IDF objectives were to dismantle Hamas. They said it at the beginning. We're not going to stop until Hamas is destroyed and dismantled. They can't do that. Their own military say they can't do that. What else did they say? They're going to get back all the hostages. Well, they're not willing to negotiate, which is generally how you get hostages back, because hostage rescue operations are a nightmare. The hostages, even if you're like Delta Force, are just as likely to die as they are to get rescued. So they can't get the hostages back militarily. They got 4 back, caused a global had a lot of information blowback from it because they killed a lot of people. They got 4 hostages back, and now that that happened, Hamas will change their entire tactics, techniques, and procedures around how they keep hostages. They're going to go back into the tunnels, and we know that Israel cannot find shit in tunnels. So they're never going to get hostages back through military action. So they can't defeat Hamas. They can't get the hostages back. Those were their main goals. And now, what were Hamas's goals? To show the world the true face of what the Israeli regime was, to discredit them militarily, which happened not even now, it happened on October 7th, because remember, that was the biggest military and intelligence failure in recent history, and to put the question of Palestinian statehood back on the table, because it was in cold storage before October 7th. So they've already achieved their goals. So like, if the adversary doesn't achieve any of their goals, but you achieve all of your goals, what do you call it? I'd say it's strategically a victory.
Yeah, I think it's totally bizarre that 9/11 too. Wasn't there some evidence that we knew in advance that this was going to happen, and yet, in the case of Israel anyway, they let it happen. And then you have things like the Hannibal Directive, and it really feels like they want to keep carrying on the war by not accepting any hostage negotiations whatsoever. Is that true?
I mean, they would love the hostages back. I think the government does want the hostages back, but they know that
would end the siege on Gaza, which they're planning beachfront property and yada yada yada.
Yeah, so I think that they know that once the fighting stops, they can never start it again. The will of the Israeli military to keep fighting is just not there. Already estimated 500,000 citizens with dual citizenship have left Israel to go back to their other country of origin. And yeah, they're starting to have to talk. They've just passed legislature to start drafting ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi Jews in Israel, because they have a manpower shortage. Also because the rest of Israel is kind of like fragmenting socially, and people are starting to really resent the fact that they don't have to fight just like everybody else, and they don't have enough time for it. But yeah, they do want the hostages back, but not as badly as they want to cleanse Gaza. So yeah, that's what I get the distinct feeling of. And like you touched on earlier, like this idea of home field advantage, Afghanistan, Vietnam, places that couldn't be defeated because you were ultimately going into their home. And is there any truth to the idea that people who you invade their home, they fight harder than people like who are just doing it for fun or for money or for whatever, like we do in the West? Well, there are a ton of foreign fighters in Afghanistan. So, it's saying that a lot of like some elements of the Taliban or the Haqqani were fighting for their homeland. It's like, but that's completely separate. But yes, they are going to fight harder, especially like the Palestinians are going to fight harder for their homeland. First of all, they've lived a life of deprivation, not having potable water, having Gaza under complete blockade, having a military occupation, dealing with it every day. They're going to have a lot higher threshold for uncomfortability, or for like things being uncomfortable, than the Israelis will have. So they'll be able to stick this out in a sustained way, where the average Israeli citizen who, maybe did 2 years of service in the IDF, then was like, I'm going to go work in the tech sector in Tel Aviv and like make, a little over 6 figures and just have a nice chill life with free healthcare. They never expected to fight again. So they went to Gaza for 3 months, and then you're seeing a lot of people be like, okay, my tour of duty in Gaza is done. I'm out of here. I'm coming back to the U.S. They're not like most people, most of the reservists who got released aren't showing back up for another rotation in Gaza. So that's really telling. And when I was in Afghanistan, I was like totally indoctrinated and totally didn't give a shit if I died. But like, also, I knew that there was like hope beyond that. I was like, but if I didn't, that would also be cool, because I could go to college in New York City and party every weekend. So, when you have opportunities to do something different, other than dying violently, you're going to be more inclined to take those than guys who are just like, I've got nothing else, got nothing left.
I've seen it said even in Western media that they're casualty averse in the IDF. Like that's the usual Western media framing. Is like, hey, they don't, because if you talk to somebody who supports Hamas or like the resistance themselves, they will say things like, yeah, you will kill 10 of us for every one of you, but you will tire of it first because that's the nature of settler colonialism and their projects. But what are you seeing like out of your footage and your reporting to support that the IDF just doesn't particularly like being killed?
Okay, well, I would say that on a superficial level, nobody does. But let me.
Hey, man, don't pigeonhole me, man. I might want to be.
I'll die right now. All right.
I'll prove it.
It's Wednesday night.
I'll die harder, bro.
I'll die. Yeah. So first of all, it was an interesting point you said. Like, for every 10, we'll kill one of you for every 10 of us. That's basically just how resistance movements are, because again, they don't have air superiority. They don't have a fleet of like high-tech predator drones that can like shoot a missile out of nowhere. So yes, the resistance is going to lose more guys than the IDF does. That's just how it goes. But again, they're not casualty averse. They know the score. They've studied other resistance movements. This is how decolonial resistance works, because the colonial forces will always have the better technology and stuff. So that's just how it goes. But yes, they are casualty averse to the point where they have put a gag order on the number of casualties they have. So the only time they really put out casualties, if you track it, is when large mass casualty events happen that they can't hide. But like one guy getting taken out by a sniper on Tuesday, another guy getting taken out on Wednesday, those sail under the radar. So yeah, there's a gag order. They're casualty averse, and their population is casualty averse, because if they start seeing like how many casualties they are all that they're taking, the threshold for what they're willing to tolerate in terms of this war continuing will decrease.
Yeah. And I was talking to ex-CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou a couple of weeks ago, and we were both talking about how Kissinger once said, right before he died, he said, "It seems to me that the U.S. foreign policy has no aim. It's aimless. It makes no sense." And this is coming from the guy who strategically, carpet bombed Cambodia and just atrocities galore. And yet he did have some strategy. Do you feel like we are totally aimless as far as starting endless wars, propping up the military-industrial complex? Do we know what the end goal is?
No, and I don't think we need to know what the end goal is. A big perk of a proxy war of attrition, like in Ukraine, or a forever war in Iraq or Afghanistan, is like that is not the main goal. The main goal is because like a lot of special interests are going to make a lot of money, and a lot of ideologues and war hawks in Washington who aren't necessarily interested in like strategic outcomes will be happy as well. So, I mean, what does U.S. foreign policy serve? It's meant to serve inherently capitalist interests, which involves the military-industrial complex, and is given an extra little wrinkle now that it's meant to serve, foreign interests like Israel. So, I don't know. I do think there are plenty of people in Washington who don't really care about exit strategies. I mean, there's no off-ramp for the war in Ukraine right now, even though it's demonstrably unsuccessful, and it looks increasingly impossible for Ukraine to regain the initiative against Russia. But we just gave them another $60 billion to future-proof the war in case the administration changes in November. And yeah, what's the end goal? So if that was actually a concern from a foreign policy perspective, we'd know about it. But it's not. That's why we never hear about defining their goals, defining their mission objectives, and giving a timeline. They will never do it because it's not a priority.
We got into a guy, a medic who's on the front lines in Ukraine. We got into a 2-part debate with this guy, and he seemed to be fairly, calm, well-spoken, and educated guy. Total fucking warmonger. Can you go into a little bit more depth of analysis about what's going on there and what are the probable outcomes of Ukraine and Russia?
Well, no, you can be really smart, and you can be analytical and stuff. I was when I was in the military doing intelligence stuff. I was still like thinking I was like completely justified. and all this was completely justified. So two things can be true at once. You can be smart, and you can also be a total dumbass when it comes to certain things, right?
Morally bankrupt. Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying that the Russians are good. It's really easy to think in terms of moral equivalence that you're the good guy when you're watching Russian soldiers do what they're notoriously and historically known for doing. But that doesn't mean the war itself is like justified, or that it couldn't have had a diplomatic solution, that it doesn't have a diplomatic solution right now. And so, the war in Ukraine, we're basically just sending money, and they have a massive manpower shortage, which Russia doesn't seem to have at the same level. Like the median age for the Ukrainian soldiers is now, 43 years old? 43? That's insane. Like, we're seeing these videos come out, and they're not just propaganda pieces by like the Russian bots, of like literally goon squads, like finding military age males, picking them off the streets and throwing them to vans for like a short military indoctrination process. There are 600,000 conscription-worthy Ukrainian males in other countries, and the Ukrainian Department of State is trying to get other countries to revoke their visas so they have to come back to Ukraine so they can be drafted. And then we have to keep propping up their economy and their weapons stores with billions and billions of dollars worth of tax money. And just from a strategic perspective, that's not indicative of a healthy war machine that's able to wage wars of attrition. And they're losing ground. There's supposed to be a counteroffensive happening this month. We'll see what We'll see what happens with that. And if nothing happens, if no progress is made with the Ukrainian counteroffensive to push Russian forces out of those 4 oblasts, which they can now control on the Russian border, it's pretty much done.
Crazy.
So what we're looking at, just one final point, is the West is never going to back down because they can't afford to look weak, and we can't afford to wage proxy wars in the future. So we'll kind of end with a frozen conflict and an ugly Russian victory that will kind of look like Russia will hold on to its territorial gains. They'll become this demilitarized zone, like we see in Cyprus, in between Turkish Cyprus and Greek Cyprus, or North and South Korea. Well, there'll be defensive lines, and it'll just stalemate in a cold armistice. And that's the most likely way, because neither side is going to back down, and the West apparently will not allow for a diplomatic solution. So.
Yeah, and just to look weak, I think it's bizarre because we pulled out of Afghanistan and went home with our tail between our legs. Come on, we could do that again. Come on, guys.
Yeah,
put a dress on and lipstick and just say, fuck it.
Well, a lot of that is people knew that Biden didn't want to be there anymore, and whoever was still in Afghanistan in another 3 years wasn't going to win the election. So it was time. There was no way to end it responsibly. So it was we got to pull the cord now.
Plus, they had to set up for Ukraine and Israel.
Well, yeah, they just set up for Ukraine. But here's one of the main reasons we pulled out of Afghanistan is because we're trying to, the U.S. government, which I don't want to be associated with, is trying to do a geostrategic shift to East Asia. The next flashpoint is Taiwan. So didn't have the military and financial capacity to be in Afghanistan and shift to Taiwan. So that's another aspect. They're shifting to East Asia.
Yeah. I wanted to get if you had any information, because we talked about this earlier today. There's protests going on in Kenya, right? This is largely because of the debts that the IMF imposed on them. And what happens when you're in debt with the IMF? They come into your country and they privatize it, make you pass austerity measures, and they do deregulation and privatization, whatever. And that basically is the Trojan horse of corporate U.S. power. And that lets them go into these countries and start siphoning resources out of a country and make it look like it's just business or whatever. Do you have any insight onto how that works and how that ties into the military-industrial complex?
Well, on a basic level, it's good to conceptualize global liberal Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the UN the UN as a certain extent is colonial enterprises. So the IMF is debt colonialism. They're able to express exert, neo-colonial control. And to be reductive, because we don't have time to go into like theory, neo-colonial is like you're able to exert colonial power without military occupation. So when we say debt colonialism as neo-colonialism, it's a way of exerting power over a country without having boots on the ground. So yes, the IMF is meant to do that, and all these systems are in place to privatize resources of another country, extract those resources, bring it back to the source of empire without military force. And yeah, there's in a system like ours, there's supposed to be a differentiation between the public and private sectors, but there isn't really one. So I am actually not tracking so much what's going on in Kenya, but there are a lot of corollaries to Congo, which I am more familiar with. So.
Oh yeah. Well, fill us in. I'm actually wondering what the hell's going on in Congo. Well, almost out of time. You got.
Yeah. I will just say, when it comes to things like the Congo, there are alternatives towards the IMF and global institutions like that. We're seeing that with BRICS, multilateral, multipolar organizations that are trying to create a more equitable exchange of like trade and infrastructure and stuff. Sorry, I've been going for like 2 hours today talking. More so than the unipolar Western-dominated world order. So like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global infrastructure plan that a lot of countries are buying into. Just because the IMF is bad and all these Western institutions are bad doesn't mean that like China and Russia aren't doing some dirty work in Africa and doing their own sort of like colonialism. So like it looks differently than what traditional Western imperialism looks like. So in the Congo, a lot of these Chinese companies, these Chinese tech companies are basically through global supply chains, again, controlled by private Chinese companies, are getting coltan out of Africa and the Congo and getting them back to China, and they're doing that through supposedly private companies. But those private companies that are extracting it and benefiting off of like child slavery and force and like debt servitude are heavily subsidized by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So just because we're bad doesn't mean like these other superpowers are just like great. And I just do want to make that one moral equivalency thing. They're just kind of like less bad. They bomb fewer countries. So the Congo is a big mess, though. That's something we should talk about more in the future. But I don't know about Kenya.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll come next time with more Kenya facts. You come back with the Congo facts. Mike, you want to ask him one more question before we get the hell out of here? Or?
No, I mean, I even as like a big supporter of China, I got to say you're not wrong at all. And that's like the same criticism I would have, even as a critical supporter. But my last question, I guess, would be, I liked your predictions for the quote unquote resolution of the proxy war in Ukraine. Can you give us any kind of loose predictions, not to put you on the spot in any way, but for the resolution of Israel and Gaza? And how do you think that's going to play out?
Well, I said in March, if there's any sanity left in this decision-making apparatus that exists between the U.S. and Israel, someone would compel a ceasefire before Ramadan starts. That didn't happen, but then again, my assumptions were made on like Israel's long-term geostrategic health or geopolitical health and it not becoming a pariah state, which doesn't seem to be a priority. So, the fact that the war has gone on this long without having any objectives achieved is kind of absurd. I think that what's going to happen is if they truly decide to shift the front to Lebanon and open up against Hezbollah, which would be insane. We don't have enough time to get into it, but it would be militarily insane. They're going to have to resolve Gaza first. So the word on the street in Lebanon, who I was talking to, is like there might be an invasion in mid-July, and if that actually happens, that's a completely hypothetical date, but these things take like 3 weeks to a month longer to mobilize an actual offensive. We would see a drawdown in hostilities in Gaza. Netanyahu doesn't seem to want to accept any sort of like ceasefire. He wants a partial ceasefire, which Hamas won't accept. So resolution is completely stalemated at this point. But we can expect a massive drawdown in operations and operational tempo in Gaza if the Lebanon front opens up, which again would be insane, but who knows? I'm basically just at the point where I'm not giving like any hard and fast predictions anymore because it's so
there's no way
insane and unprecedented. So
Smart.
Yeah, I'm just
I was
hoping for the
about to
collapse
say,
of Israel.
Yeah.
well, if they do open up a Lebanese front, it's going to happen.
It might. I would say you got a few million Israelis over there. You have 1.5 billion Muslims, and if they all get upset enough at that kind of behavior, Israel is very well temporary. It's a temporary satellite, and like you said, we're in uncharted waters. Every day I wake up, I go, I didn't think that was going to happen, and it did.
Yeah.
So. Interesting world we live in, folks. Well, look, you'll come back. You'll do it again. Love to meet you. Love to have you. Greg J. Stoker, the one and only. Check him out all over the place. He's got a new show on Mint Press. What's it called?
State of Play, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's a live stream. This Friday, it's going to be potentially pretty much conscientious objectors from the U.S. Air Force are coming on to talk about that. So.
Nice. Cool. All right. Well, come back again. Mike from Turn Leftist, go check him out. Follow him. He's got the podcast. We're all in cahoots. We'll sign off. We'll talk to Greg real quick afterwards. All right.